thank you also for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be in this forum. Just a few words of background before I'll introduce our research. There have been a few studies in Australia about climate change education in primary schools and lower secondary schools. But thus far, there hasn't been any research that asked the question, so after 12 years of schooling, what do our students learn about climate change at school by the time they leave school? So we thought of doing putting the first foot on that pathway, and we started by examining the upper secondary curriculum. So this is what we're about. Tom, am I able to share the screen? Can
yes. We need to make you a co-host. I'll do.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen. So the title of this research was Examination of Climate Change and Conceptualization within Upper Secondary Victorian Curriculum, and the study was conducted by myself, Virendra Prasad, Helen Widdop-Quintum at Victoria University. The aims of the study were to examine the conceptualization and integration of climate change education within the Victorian Certificate of Education, the VCE, in the state of Victoria. Specifically, we wish to identify and describe potential gaps. So the gap between the nature of climate change and its representation within the curriculum. So just a few words to explain what I mean by the nature of climate change. A body of knowledge can be characterized by its nature. In science education, we discuss a lot what is the nature of science. And there are a whole range of characteristics that characterizes and distinguishes the nature of science as distinguished from other disciplines such as arts, music, and other disciplinary areas. So we wanted to see if climate change, what is the nature of climate change as a body of knowledge, and what is the gap in its representation within the curriculum, if there is a gap. The second aim was to identify the gap between the scope of climate change as it is understood by the scientific community and the scope of climate change as it is represented in the curriculum. And the third aim was to identify the gap in regard to what may be regarded as best practice curriculum integration and the current approach to integration. For some background, the obvious is that climate change is the most major threat of our time, posing unprecedented challenges to humanity. Less obvious is that very scarce research examined the uptake of climate change education in curriculum documents across the globe. Evidence suggests that in primary and middle schools, when climate change appears, it is mostly integrated within sustainability education, but often this is done voluntarily as a cross-curriculum priority by a few teachers, which are not the majority. In the upper secondary schools, most studies advocate cross-curriculum integration as the best practice approach with no evidence for its success. The OECD suggested that has expressed concerns that curriculum reforms suffer time lag between the recognition that a change is needed to the actual implementation. For some major paradigm shifts and scientific discoveries, the time lag between discovery and implementation in school curricula may span over many generations. Some examples for time lag between discoveries and integration in school curricula are, for example, Einstein's paradigm shift. So Einstein published his general theory of relativity in 1915. His equations did away with Newton's theory of gravity and replaced it with curved space and wrapped time. This fundamental paradigm shift is still only partially reflected in F-10 curricula in Australia 104 years later. The majority of students who do not study physics in years 11 and 12 remain with physics knowledge no more recent than 1865. Charles Darwin published his seminal book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in 1859. It took 120 years until in 1981, the National Center for Science Education was founded in the USA with the aim of advocating the teaching of evolution in public schools. And what about climate change? The Earth's natural greenhouse effect was discovered in 1824 by Joseph Fourier. Fast forward, in 1961, the scientific community was ready for a paradigm shift with Charles David Keeling's production of the Keeling curve, showing the progressive buildup of atmospheric carbon dioxide. What about the curriculum? It is still unknown. Is climate change education integrated? How is climate change integrated? How is climate change conceptualized? What is the scope of contents addressed by the curricula? And does the cross-curriculum integration approach work? So the study put forward the following questions. How is climate change conceptualized in the Victorian upper secondary curriculum? What is the scope of climate change content knowledge present in the study designs identified as addressing climate change? How is cross-curriculum integrated approach addressed by the examined study design? So the VCE, the upper secondary curriculum in Victoria and elsewhere in Australia, is organized in study designs. Each study design is a syllabus for a specific subject in the VCE. So we have physics, chemistry, and so on. In Victoria, we have 94 study designs. In order to address these questions, there was a need to do some preparatory work before we could proceed to analyze the curriculum. So in regard to the question, is climate change integrated within the upper secondary curriculum? There was a need for identification of key climate change terms and applying these terms for identifying climate change within the VCE study design. So how do we know that a study design is actually teaching climate change? Because climate change is very broad. So if a study design discusses migration and displacement, is that climate change? Or if a study design discusses species extinction, is that climate change? So to do that, we had to identify some key words that unquestionably identify these study designs as addressing climate change, and we did that. In regard to the second question, how is climate change conceptualized? There was a need for identification of essential characteristics of the nature of climate change, because there need to be some benchmark when we are looking at how climate change is conceptualized by the study designs. There was the first to need to do some kind of preliminary work in identifying essential characteristics of climate change as a body of knowledge. And finally, in regard to the question, what is the scope of climate change contents addressed by the curricula, there was a need for framing the scope of climate change in terms of associated content knowledge. So the 94 study designs of the Victorian curriculum were analyzed, and we found that climate change is present in 10 study designs: the Australian and global politics, environmental science, physics, economics, agriculture and horticulture studies, geography, systems engineering, chemistry, outdoor and environmental studies, and food studies. In regard to the question, how is climate change conceptualized, systematic literature review revealed 4 characteristics distinguishing the nature of climate change as a body of knowledge. And these consist of complexity and multi-system interactions, cross-disciplinary approaches, including multi-inter-and-trans, inherently involves human action, and it is future-oriented and uncertainty. In regard to uncertainty, there's a need to differentiate between 2 types of uncertainty. The first is uncertainty related to public skepticism regarding the validity of climate change projections. This uncertainty, this type of uncertainty is produced by the media and sponsored by the large corporates, but it is not inherent to the nature of climate change as a body of knowledge. The type of uncertainty that is inherent to climate change as a body of knowledge is is derived from three sources. The first source of uncertainty is forcing. It arises from incomplete knowledge of the factors influencing the climate system, such as future trajectories in regard to greenhouse gas emissions. The second source is model uncertainty, and it relates to differences in algorithms used in the various models, thus causing different models to yield different future projections. And finally, the third source, internal variability, relates to natural variability of the climate system that occurs in the absence of external forcing, and it includes processes intrinsic to the atmosphere, the ocean, and the coupled ocean-atmosphere systems. The four characteristics were used for identifying the conceptualization of the nature of climate change within the study designs, and we also looked for other expressions of conceptualizations within these study designs. So we came up with this map, and the main findings are as follows. None of the VCE study designs presents a complete conceptualization of the nature of climate change. Australian and global politics and environmental science represent three characteristics, and outdoor and environmental studies has no representation of these conceptualizations. Most study designs present CC conceptualization as either a cause or as an outcome or as a problem of management or technology. Only Australian and global politics presents climate change as a crisis of humanity, which it is. Two study designs present clear misunderstanding regarding climate change. So in environmental environmental science study designs, they claim that astronomical and solar systems are responsible for climate change, and this is incorrect. They also claim that the enhanced greenhouse effect causes climate change rather than forming part of climate change processes. We also found misconceptions in outdoor and environmental studies. These study designs claims that climate change is a natural change, which is incorrect. And it claims that it is debatable whether humans are causing climate change or perhaps not. And there's a confusion between the uncertainty derived from public skepticism regarding climate change. As I mentioned before, it is a media artifact, and the uncertainties inherent to the nature of climate change. Finally, we found that across the various study designs, the term climate change is often concealed under alternative code terms that are probably more politically accepted. So, for example, in environmental science, they use the term enhanced greenhouse effect rather than the internationally accepted term climate change. In physics, they use the term climate science rather than the term climate change. Throughout the whole physics design, study designs, even though this study design does teach climate change, it doesn't use the term climate change at all. Only the term climate science, and this is a very reductionist term because climate science is just climatology, and climate change includes geography, oceanographic, political science, and many more disciplines. Okay, in regard to the question, what is the scope of climate change contents addressed by the curricula, we asked, how do we know whether a student who learned about climate change in accordance to the study design in a particular subject is sufficiently informed about climate change? How would we know if there are holes left unaddressed in the study designs that may roll over to holes in students' climate change knowledge? In other words, the mere fact that climate change terms such as greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide are mentioned in the study design is insufficient to convince us that climate change is addressed appropriately. A climate change content scoping map was developed for identifying the comprehensiveness of climate change in the study designs using systematic literature review. And what we came up with is the following. So we looked at all the contents that come under climate change as a body of knowledge, and we align them along a continuum of perspectives ranging from more science-based facts to more humanity-based aspects of climate change, including socio-economical, political structures, networks, ethics, and conducts. And then we organized all these contents under 8 themes along this continuum. And the 8 themes are observed changes in climate change, in the climate, drivers of climate change, future climate change, risks and impacts, adaptation and mitigation, socioeconomic, policy and governments, and ethics. And then finally, we organized all the content all the content knowledge under these 8 themes by fundamental questions and essential content knowledge. And we came up with quite a large map of climate change contents. So the next step was to go to the study designs, the 10 study designs, and examine to what extent each of these themes is represented in each of the study designs. And we gave them a score ranging between 0, no content, to 3, comprehensive content for each of the 8 themes, and the maximum score could be 24. And the findings in regard to the gap between the scope of climate change themes and the representation in the study designs, what we found is that across the 10 study designs, climate change content themes remain mostly unaddressed by the Victorian VCE curriculum. Only the Australian and global politics study design addresses climate change in a comprehensive way with a score of 17 out of 24 points. However, the climate change unit is offered as an elective and thus may not be taught at all. The teacher has an option to either teach climate change for the VCE or teach another topic. It's not compulsory within this VCE study designs to teach this unit of climate change. Environmental science received 1/3 of the points, scoring 8. All other subjects received scores ranging from 0 to 4. The most commonly addressed theme is adaptation and mitigation, followed by drivers of climate change. None of the study designs addresses the ethics theme. Climate change content knowledge implementation lag is expressed through both scarcity of information and its anecdotal appearance. The climate change themes appear in the curriculum mostly in a disorganized and incoherent way, often emphasizing only one of 2 themes and neglecting the others. Oops. The most highly addressed theme is mitigation and adaptation, whereas ethics is consistently absent. However, mitigation and adaptation inherently involve ethical decisions of equity and justice, as those who are most vulnerable to climate change contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions. The findings suggest that the humanistic perspectives of climate change are underrepresented, and overall, it is highly unlikely that a VCE graduate is informed about climate change at any sufficient level if the teaching in class was in accordance to the 93 out of the 94 examined study designs. In regard to cross-curriculum integration, none of the study designs addresses cross-curriculum integration in any way. The various study designs seem to operate in silos in regard to climate change education. The study designs provide no indication as to how students may complement their climate change knowledge beyond the fragmented pieces of information provided in the various study designs. In some study designs, there appears to be an unsubstantiated assumption that students have prior knowledge on climate change. And we know from other studies relating to primary and lower secondary that the situation is no different. In regard to the gap between best practice curriculum integration and the existing approach to integration, cross-curriculum integration is often promoted in the literature as best practice for climate change education. However, there is lacking evidence supporting this approach. Contrarily, Bacon and colleagues found major obstacles when attempting to implement the approach. The findings of this study clearly suggest that the cross-curriculum integration approach is not effective in educating about climate change and needs to be replaced by an evidence-based approach. In conclusion, the complexity of climate change and the inseparability of its parts call for establishing a new curriculum subject dedicated to climate change education. This approach may have multiple gains by providing a framework for specialization among teachers, which in turn may improve the quality of climate change teaching and learning for students. In addition, by establishing a senior secondary climate change subject, more opportunities may arise for rigorous discussions regarding pedagogical models and strategies for successful implementation of climate change education. Thank you.